In the heart of Manhattan, where power hides behind polished doors and truth wears a tailored smile, a strange mystery unfolds, a gun that kills twice, yet cannot be found. When a trembling woman brings her secret to Nero Wolfe's brownstone, deceit, art, and politics intertwine in a deadly masquerade. Every lie glitters. Every silence costs. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was one of those Manhattan mornings when even the sun looks lazy. The brownstone was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the rustle of newspaper pages being turned by a man who would rather be reading the dictionary. Wolfe was settled behind his desk, half buried in the Times and entirely immovable. Fritz was in the kitchen, orchestrating breakfast with the solemnity of a cathedral organist. I was enjoying the peace while it lasted. Wolfe had no appointments, no quarrels with Inspector Kramer scheduled, and no reason to raise his voice before noon. That's when Fritz knocked, a gentle, apologetic tap that usually meant trouble in silk. "Mr. Goodwin," he said softly, his accent bending the vowels. "There is a lady to see Mr. Wolfe. She insists it is urgent." Wolfe grunted something that might have been Latin for "send her away." "She wears perfume," Fritz added. "Expensive." That was all the warning I needed. The scent hit me halfway to the hall, sharp, floral, and expensive enough to make my paycheck feel like a joke. I opened the door, and there she stood, nervous, beautiful, and trouble all wrapped up in silver fox. She stepped into the office like someone crossing a minefield. Every movement was graceful, deliberate, except her hands, which couldn't stop fidgeting with the clasp of her handbag. Her stole shimmered in the morning light, and the perfume had already declared war on the oxygen supply. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice soft but trembling. "I'm sorry to come unannounced, but it's a matter of great delicacy." "Delicacy," Wolfe muttered, eyeing her like a chess piece. "They always are." He didn't rise, of course. The man would stay seated through an earthquake. She turned those wide blue eyes on me, as if I might offer a more humane species of reception. I smiled helpfully, which only encouraged her to clutch her gloves tighter. "I was told you solve problems," she said. "My husband's life may depend on it." Wolfe sighed. "Madam, my facilities are at your disposal, within the limits of reason. Please be explicit." She hesitated. "Not until I know this is confidential." Wolfe's tone sharpened. "My discretion is not a commodity. Speak or don't, but pray decide before my lunch is delayed." I caught her eye and nodded slightly. Whatever she had, it wasn't going to be dull. "My husband," she began, "is being blackmailed. The man claims to have proof that Roger owns a firearm, a German Mauser pistol, used in the Wall Street shooting last month." She paused, watching Wolfe's face for a reaction. She might have been watching a stone Buddha. "But," she continued, "there is no such gun. Roger has never owned one. The entire thing is a fabrication, yet the man demands $10,000 to remain silent." I leaned forward. "And you're sure your husband never owned it?" Her voice cracked. "Positive. Roger's terrified of weapons." Wolfe sniffed. "A curious paradox. A man accused of owning a weapon fears the weapon itself. Intriguing." She went on, words tumbling faster now. "The blackmailer sent us a photograph of the gun. He claims it was found at the murder scene, wiped clean, with Roger's initials on the grip, but the police never reported that." That earned a flicker from Wolfe's eyelids, a minor miracle. "Indeed, Mr. Goodwin, note the precision of her phrasing. He claims. That word will be useful." I nodded, though the case already smelled of bad cologne and worse company. The lady clutched her gloves like they were a lifeline. "You believe me, don't you?" Wolfe gave her a look colder than marble. "Belief is for priests. I deal in proof." Wolfe leaned back, eyes half-lidded, hands folded like a judge about to issue sentence. "Madam, blackmail without substance is a farce. A man cannot be coerced by an illusion unless he grants it weight. Why then does your husband tremble? She blinked, unsure whether it was an insult. Because he's afraid of scandal. His firm is already under scrutiny. Even a false accusation can ruin him, Wolfe finished. Aha. Fear, then, is the blackmailer's weapon, not the gun. I couldn't help myself. That's deep. Maybe you should put it on a poster. Wolfe ignored me, as usual. Who else knows of this matter? No one, she said quickly. Not even the police. Roger forbade it. Wolfe's lips thinned. So he chooses secrecy over sanity. Admirable consistency and folly. The lady winced. I offered her a sympathetic smile. Wolfe was like that, charming as a cactus and twice as prickly. He leaned forward slightly. Continue, madam. If this phantom pistol exists only in another man's words, then somewhere between those words and your fear lies the truth. She swallowed hard. I can show you something, she whispered, and that was when the game truly began. From her bag, she withdrew a small brown envelope and set it on Wolfe's desk like it might bite her. He stared at it, unmoving, until I took the hint and opened it. Inside was a glossy photograph, a Mauser pistol, polished to a shine, resting on velvet. I slid it toward Wolfe. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time that morning, he leaned forward. That alone told me this was no longer a social call. He said. The weapon exists, at least visually. Where did this originate? It was mailed to us, she said. No note, just that picture. Postmark? New York, she said. 2 days ago. Wolfe examined the print like it was a rare butterfly. You see, Archie, the light source is artificial, angled from above. Professional photography. And note the reflection in the metal. There, faintly. The corner of a patterned rug. I squinted. So what? The guy's got taste. So, Wolfe corrected. The photograph was taken indoors, probably in the same room where the pistol was displayed. A collector's room. Possibly our victim's. Her breath caught. Then it's real. That, madam, remains to be seen. But someone wishes you to think so, and that, too, is evidence. Wolfe set the photograph down carefully, his fingers resting on it like a priest over scripture. Archie, he said, fetch the directory. We'll begin with the dead. While she watched, I jotted down notes. Something about her story didn't fit. The kind of gap you can drive a taxi through. Your husband, I asked. When did he first get this photograph? Yesterday morning. And he told you immediately? She hesitated. That evening. I gave Wolfe a look. He gave me one back that said, I noticed it too. You said the blackmailer demanded money, Wolfe said. Yet no letter accompanied the photograph. Did he call? No, Roger just assumed. Indeed. Wolfe closed his eyes, fingertips pressed together. That was the signal his brain had started cooking. Assumption breeds error, madam. Your husband's or yours, I cannot yet tell. I caught another detail, her wedding ring, a shade too loose. Nervous fingers kept twisting it, as though she wasn't sure she still deserved to wear it. Wolfe's voice was low and deliberate. You have omitted something. Pray correct that. She bit her lip. No, it's nothing. Then, madam, he said, it is something. The silence stretched long enough for me to start counting ceiling panels. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes. Very well, I'll take your case. My fee is $2,000, payable in advance. Her eyes widened. That's absurd. Correct, Wolfe agreed, but necessary. The absurdity will discourage triviality. She sighed, reached into her bag and produced a checkbook. The pen trembled in her hand. You'll help us. I'll investigate, Wolfe said. Help is a philanthropic act, and I'm no philanthropist. When she left a few minutes later, I followed her to the door. She paused in the vestibule, eyes darting toward the street. Across the road, a man stood half hidden behind a lamppost. a notebook in hand. His hat was low, his coat high. He scribbled something as the lady's taxi pulled away. I shut the door, locked it, and turned to Wolfe. "We've got company." Wolfe grunted. "We always do. Archie." This one merely had the courtesy to write it down. I headed for the phone. Whatever game had started, it was already moving faster than Wolfe liked, and that meant it was about to get interesting. Mornings in the brownstone have a rhythm, and by 11:30 it was playing in 3/4 time. Fritz was orchestrating lunch in the kitchen, pots clinking, knives whispering, and something that smelled suspiciously like veal simmering on the stove. Upstairs, Wolfe was giving his orchids their daily sermon, and I was in the office, pretending to work while mostly enjoying how quiet the world was. That piece lasted exactly 6 minutes. The doorbell went off like a fire alarm in a convent. I glanced at the clock, sighed and muttered, "Too early for clients, too late for delivery men." When I opened the door, my suspicion was confirmed, and then some. Standing there was Inspector Kramer, scowl-loaded, coat half-buttoned, and a look on his face that said the morning had already committed 3 felonies. "Goodwin," he growled, brushing past me. "Where's Wolfe?" I let the door close behind him with a click. "Upstairs," I said, "admiring orchids. You can barge in there too if you want to get strangled with a watering hose." Kramer didn't laugh. He never does. And that's how the pre-lunch piece ended, with a bell, a bulldozer, and a headache wearing a badge. Kramer's version of entering a room was the kind that should have come with sound effects. He stormed through the office doorway like he was leading a raid, his coat flapping behind him like a flag of war. "Where is he?" he demanded again. "Where he always is," I said. "Behind the desk, like the Pope on his throne. Try knocking. It's a human custom." Wolfe didn't look up from his chair. He had returned from the plant rooms a few minutes earlier and was now seated, large and unmovable, reading a slim volume of Horace. Kramer's entrance didn't so much as wrinkle his composure. "Inspector," Wolfe murmured, "you might preserve your energy for a more profitable outburst. This office is not the precinct." Kramer glared. "You've got nerve, Wolfe. I didn't come here for Latin quotes." I leaned against the globe near Wolfe's desk, hands in my pockets. "Then you came to the wrong address. That's the house specialty." Kramer turned on me. "Pipe down, Goodwin. I want answers." "Then ask questions," I said pleasantly. He jabbed a thumb toward Wolfe. "Fine, I've got one. Where's the Mauser?" That name hit the air like a crack of static. Wolfe looked up at last, eyes cold and bright. Kramer slapped a manila folder onto Wolfe's desk, hard enough to make dust jump. "That's the report," he said. "Wall Street shooting. You've read about it. Victim, Gregory Alton, investment broker. Weapon, German Mauser pistol, pre-war, serial number filed off. Yesterday it disappeared from the evidence room." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "You suspect me of burglary now?" Kramer's jaw flexed. "I suspect you of knowing more than you're saying." "Always a safe assumption," Wolfe replied dryly. "But alas, not always a useful one." I opened the folder and skimmed the top page. "You sure you didn't misplace it, Inspector? Maybe it slipped behind a donut box." "Stow it, Goodwin." Kramer's voice was a growl. "2 witnesses claim a certain woman hired a detective recently. Private, discreet. You, maybe?" I shrugged. "We get a lot of women, Inspector. It's the tie." Wolfe interjected smoothly. "You're suggesting, then, that this missing Mauser and my client, whom I shall not confirm or deny, are in conjunction?" Kramer nodded grimly. "I'm suggesting someone's playing games with evidence, and if I find your fat fingerprints on that gun, I'll make sure you're reading Latin behind bars." Wolfe's lips curved. "You might try to prove it first." If there's one thing Wolfe can't abide, it's an accusation that insults his intelligence. The Mauser may have vanished, but Kramer's dignity was about to follow it. "Inspector," Wolfe began, folding his hands, "you are as predictable as gravity. A gun vanishes from a locked police vault, and because you cannot imagine an explanation above your reach, you conjure one below it." Kramer's color deepened. "You calling me stupid?" I'm implying it, Wolfe said evenly. To call you that outright would be redundant. I had to turn a cough into a laugh. Kramer took a step forward, fists tight. You think this is funny? A man's been murdered. 2, if you count the dealer found last night, and you're cracking jokes. I do not jest about murder, Wolfe replied, but I do reserve the right to correct sloppy reasoning. He leaned back, his voice soft but cutting. If you possess the mental agility to observe pattern rather than panic, you might note that the disappearance of a gun coinciding with the discovery of another corpse indicates not concealment, but substitution. You are looking for theft where you should be searching for design. Kramer's mouth opened, then shut. The silence was worth framing. Wolfe finally waved a hand. Now, if you are quite done thundering, Inspector, I should like my lunch unspoiled. Fritz entered then, like divine timing in an apron, carrying Wolfe's sacred midday beer. The aroma floated through the room, instantly clashing with Kramer's aftershave and attitude. Ah, Wolfe said with deep satisfaction. Civilization endures. Kramer scowled. You're drinking, while I'm talking about murder. Wolfe raised the glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. Your subject matter is no reason to abandon nourishment. On the contrary, it enhances digestion. I grinned. You heard the man, Inspector. Beer trumps bluster. Kramer rounded on me. You think this is all a joke, Goodwin? Not all, I said. Just the parts you write. Wolfe's voice sliced through before Kramer could retort. Gentlemen, if we must quarrel, let us at least be articulate. Inspector, emotion is the refuge of the incompetent. I suggest you seek a more comfortable shelter. Kramer made a noise somewhere between a snort and a growl. You'll eat those words, Wolfe. Possibly, Wolfe said serenely, setting his glass down. But for now, I prefer veal. That nearly sent Kramer through the ceiling. If Fritz hadn't been there, I might have bet on a homicide of our own. Kramer finally snapped the folder shut and stuffed it under his arm. You think you're smarter than the police? Fine. Keep your smug mouth shut, but remember this. Someone saw a man leaving the Wall Street building the night of the shooting. He was carrying a parcel about so big. He held his hands apart, about the size of a pistol case. That's your mystery, Wolfe. Maybe your client knows who he was. Wolfe's gaze sharpened, a flicker like lightning behind his calm. Indeed, he said quietly. And this witness, anonymous, I presume. Anonymous to you, Kramer snapped. Not to me. And if I find out you're hiding that gun, I'll… Inspector, Wolfe interrupted, his voice silk over steel. Your threats are as tedious as your syntax. Kindly remove them from my premises. Kramer took a step closer to the desk. You think this is over? The Mauser's going to turn up, and when it does, I'll make sure it points straight to you. Wolfe smiled faintly. Then you'd better pray it's loaded. Kramer glared, then turned on his heel and stomped out, slamming the door so hard the orchids upstairs might have shivered. Wolfe let out a breath, not exasperation, but calculation. Archie, he said, eyes half closed. Retrieve the morning paper. Somewhere in those columns lies a story Kramer's too dim to read. Sure, I said, heading for the hall. And while I'm at it, should I order a bulletproof vest or just another case of beer? Wolfe didn't answer. He didn't need to. If there's one thing New York never lacks, it's people trying not to be noticed. My lady client, wrapped in silver fox and gilt, fit right in. It was just past noon, and the city was its usual three-ring circus, horns blaring, pigeons panicking, and cabbies auditioning for opera. I followed her through the crowd, keeping 2 car lengths behind and a wisecrack in reserve. She moved fast for someone afraid of shadows, darting glances at every passing face. Her hat, a perky little number that might have been fashionable 10 years ago, sat askew, giving her the look of a woman who dressed in the dark and worried about it all day. She crossed Madison, paused by a florist's window, and checked her reflection like she expected to find an assassin behind it. Whatever game she was in, it wasn't a quiet one. By the time she reached East 68th, I already knew two things. She wasn't heading to a lawyer, and she was lying about not knowing the victim. The direction was a giveaway. It led straight into the kind of neighborhood where guilt wears pearls. I slowed as she stopped in front of an apartment house with a doorman who looked allergic to strangers. She went inside, giving the doorman a smile that probably used to work on better men. I waited a minute, then slipped in behind a delivery boy carrying a basket of orchids. Wolfe would have called it poetic symmetry. The elevator operator didn't bother asking my business. A confident nod gets you farther than a badge in Manhattan. I got off one floor below hers and climbed the rest on foot. The hallway smelled like old money and new perfume. At the end of the corridor, her voice carried through a cracked door. I stayed in the shadows, catching fragments. He said it was destroyed. Not what you think. Roger had nothing to do with, please, Eleanor. The name clicked. Eleanor Alton, widow of Gregory Alton, the man shot with the missing Mauser. I risked a glance. Mrs. Alton stood stiff by the window, tall and trim, her black dress crisp enough to cut glass. The fox-stoled liar stood opposite, clutching her bag, as if it held her soul. There was no mistaking the tone, guilt dressed up as sympathy. When the door finally shut, my lady's face was pale as frost. She descended the stairs quickly, and I followed, because there's nothing like fresh deceit to build an appetite. Her next stop was downtown, a curious shift from penthouse class to pawnshop grit. The cab let her off on 47th, where the jewellery stores huddle like old conspirators. She entered an antique shop squeezed between a tailor and a pawnbroker. The sign read, A. Loring, Fine Antiquities. Inside, the lighting was moody enough to make the dust look romantic. I went in 30 seconds later, whistling low, and pretended to admire a cracked bronze bust that could have been Caesar, or Kramer before coffee. Behind the counter stood Loring himself, sleek, narrow, and polished, the kind of man who looked like he'd sell you a fake Rembrandt with a genuine smile. He smelled faintly of imported cigars and risk. My client was already there, speaking in low tones. I caught a few words: photograph, gone, dangerous, and saw her slip an envelope across the counter. Loring didn't open it. He just tapped it twice, like a man acknowledging payment for something that shouldn't exist. I picked up a brass clock and asked about the price. He looked up sharply, eyes calculating, but smiled when he saw my grin. Not for sale, he said smoothly. Neither am I said, and left before the walls started whispering. The lady followed minutes later, her face pale again. That made 3 shades of fear in one afternoon. I ducked into a pay booth near the corner, dropped a nickel, and dialed the brownstone. Fritz answered, sounding like a man who considered telephones unworthy of civilization. Goodwin, I said. Put me through to Wolfe before his orchids rebel. There was a sigh, then a click. Wolfe's voice came on, smooth and heavy as molasses. Well? She's been busy, I said. First, a visit to Mrs. Alton, our dead broker's widow. Then a chat with one Mr. Loring, art dealer and general dealer of the suspicious. She handed him an envelope. Didn't look like love letters. Predictable. That got me. Predictable. You knew she'd see both. Of course. The triangle is obvious. Guilt, opportunity, and the absence of candor. Continue your surveillance. Sure, I said, but she's not the type to dine alone. Neither are you, Wolfe replied. Yet you survive. The line went dead. That was Wolfe's version of good luck. I stepped back into the street. The lady was emerging from the shop, clutching her bag tighter than ever. Time to move in. I caught up with her halfway to the corner. Mrs. Dale, I said, matching her pace. You forgot to buy your antiques. She startled, nearly dropping her handbag. Mr. Goodwin, what are you doing here? Taking a walk, I said. A healthy habit, but more fun with company. I told you I'd call if... Sure, but Wolfe worries about his clients, especially the ones who lie. Her eyes flashed. I haven't lied. Then we'll call it selective truth. You didn't mention Mrs. Alton, and you didn't mention Mr. Loring. Maybe you just have a fondness for bereaved women and crooked dealers. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. The traffic roared around us, horns blaring like judgment. I leaned closer. Mrs. Alton looked upset, I said softly. And you looked scared. Now that could mean a lot of things, but mostly it means trouble. She drew a shaky breath. You don't understand. Then explain it. She looked around, spotted a bench, and sat down hard. Please, Mr. Goodwin, don't tell Mr. Wolfe, not yet. I raised an eyebrow. That'll be a tough sell. He's got ears sharper than your nerves. She gripped her purse tighter. If you knew the truth, you'd hate me. Lady, I said, I don't hate people for lying. If I did, I'd have no social life. She didn't smile. It's not just lying, she whispered. It's what I lied about. It was getting dark when she finally started talking. The streetlight above us flickered, throwing stripes of gold and shadow across her face. I lied, she said, about my husband. Roger isn't innocent. I didn't interrupt. When someone's pulling their soul out by inches, you let them. He did own a gun, a Mauser, but it wasn't the one that killed Gregory Alton. That's what I thought at first. Now I'm not sure. Not sure how? I asked. Her eyes glistened. Because someone switched it. The night before the shooting, he told me he'd given the pistol to a collector friend, for safekeeping. I never asked who. Then, after the murder, he said it was gone, stolen, and now the police say it's the same gun that killed Alton. I whistled softly. That's a neat trick. Losing a murder weapon you claim doesn't exist. He swore to me it was a coincidence, she said, but the blackmailer knew details no one else could. I thought paying him might protect Roger, but after I saw Mrs. Alton today... She stopped, biting her lip. What about Mrs. Alton? I asked. She's protecting someone too, someone she shouldn't. And Loring? Her gaze flicked toward the shop behind us. He's not just an art dealer. He sells more dangerous things than paintings. I took that in, watching her tremble. The city hummed around us, indifferent as ever. Mrs. Dale, I said, you've told one truth and another lie. Care to tell me which is which? She stood abruptly. Tell Mr. Wolfe I'm sorry, she said. But I can't stay alive if I tell him everything. And before I could stop her, she vanished into the crowd, leaving me with one confession, 2 corpses, and a headache growing by the minute. The call came just after 8, while I was contemplating whether breakfast counted as work. The voice on the line was male, low, and calm enough to sound rehearsed. Mr. Goodwin. That's what it says on my laundry tags. You might want to visit Mr. Loring's antique shop on 47th, he said evenly. Soon. Why? Is he having a sale? Not exactly. The line went dead before I could get a name, address, or insult in. I stood there for a second, listening to the dial tone hum like a mosquito. Whoever he was, he didn't sound like a crank. Too controlled. Fritz looked up from polishing silver as I reached for my hat. Out again, Archie. Mr. Wolfe. Tell Wolfe breakfast was lovely, I said. And if anyone calls, tell them I'm admiring antiques. If he asks what kind, tell him the kind that bleed. Outside, the morning had teeth. I grabbed a cab and gave the driver the address, wondering what kind of man calls to deliver a warning with the politeness of a butler. Something told me I was heading for a story that wouldn't fit neatly in Wolfe's filing cabinet. The antique shop looked the same from the outside. Dusty windows, crooked lettering, and enough grime to qualify as insulation. But the door was ajar, and that wasn't standard operating procedure for a man like Loring, who probably locked his toothpaste. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me. Metallic, heavy, unmistakable. You never forget it after the first crime scene. Blood has a way of making itself at home in the air. The lights were low, only one bulb flickering behind the counter. The silence had weight. I called out once. No answer. Somewhere in the back, something dripped. I moved slowly, my hand brushing the revolver in my pocket. The place looked half-staged, like someone had tidied up just enough to hide what mattered. A lamp lay on its side. The cash register was open, empty. A chair overturned. Then I saw it. Smudges on the floor, leading toward the basement door, half covered by footprints. One print was fresh, smaller than mine. I hesitated, just long enough to regret it, then turned the knob. It was unlocked. The metallic smell got thicker as I went down the steps. I already knew what I'd find. I just didn't know who wanted me to find it. The basement was cluttered with wooden crates, rolled up rugs, and enough cobwebs to qualify as decor. And there, sprawled face up in the middle of the floor, was Albert Loring, late of the antique trade. He'd been shot once, square through the chest, neat as a geometry problem. No sign of struggle, no weapon nearby, just a broken wine bottle on its side, dripping red into the dust. For a second, I thought it was blood. It wasn't. Burgundy. Classy, I muttered. A murder with vintage accompaniment. I crouched beside the body. Loring's eyes were open, glassy. His hands were limp but clean, no signs of a fight. His jacket pocket was turned inside out. Someone had been looking for something, and they'd found it. I checked the shelves, more antiques, more junk, all untouched. Whoever killed him knew what they wanted and where it was. I stood, brushing the dust off my knees, and noticed something odd. The bullet hole was high, angled slightly downward. Either the killer was tall, or Loring had been kneeling. I heard sirens then, faint, but growing louder. Someone had been faster on the phone than me. When I turned back to the body, I caught a glint near his hand. Something small, metallic, and cold. It wasn't the gun, but it was a clue that didn't belong to antiques. 2 minutes later, the basement was full of police shoes, flashlights, and bad manners. Inspector Kramer led the parade, chewing on a cigar that wasn't lit, and a temper that was. "Well, well," he said, spotting me near the stairs. "Goodwin, of course." "Morning, Inspector. You're early for the matinee." "Don't start. You just can't keep your nose out of corpses, can you?" "Depends on the corpse." He ignored that and barked to his men. "Seal the place. Nobody in or out." Then he turned to me. "You touch anything?" "Just the air. It's public property." "Yeah, and you contaminate that too." He stomped closer. "What are you doing here, Goodwin? Checking your client's handiwork?" That one landed like a sucker punch, but I kept my smile. "You mean Mrs. Dale? I didn't know she collected dead dealers." He jabbed a thumb at the body. "Shot clean through with a 9mm. But my guess? It's that same missing Mauser. Neat hole, same caliber, same smell of money." "Money smells now." "Yeah," Kramer said, "and you stink of it." I didn't answer. You can't win an argument with a man who enjoys losing his temper. One of his men handed him a small metallic object, the one I'd seen near the body. Kramer turned it over and grinned like a wolf. "Recognition, Goodwin?" he asked. "Sure," I said. "It's shiny, round, and bad for business." Kramer took a step forward, holding the spent shell casing like a trophy. "Ballistics will tell me what I already know. The same gun that killed Alton killed this guy, and if your boss thinks he's not involved, he's dreaming." I tilted my head. "You ever notice, Inspector, how your theories always tie up too neatly, like a Christmas package with the wrong tag?" He scowled. "You think this is coincidence?" "I think it's convenient," I said. "Too convenient. A missing gun pops up just long enough to kill 2 men, both tied to the same woman, and then disappears again. That's not coincidence. It's choreography." Kramer snorted. "You always talk like that when you're guilty of something." "I'm guilty of having better vocabulary." He glared, then barked orders to his men. They started snapping photos and taking notes like they were auditioning for a crime serial. When he turned back, his voice was lower. "Tell Wolfe he's not outsmarting me this time. The next time I come to that brownstone, it won't be for conversation." "Bring beer," I said. He likes guests who contribute. Kramer's cigar nearly cracked between his teeth. If the case was getting hot, Wolfe would need to do what he hated most. Think on his feet. Or in his case, think sitting down. Back on the street, I ducked into another pay booth and dialed the brownstone. Wolfe answered on the third ring, which for him was practically sprinting. I gave him the rundown. Loring dead, the Mauser theory, Kramer breathing fire. Pfoy, Wolfe said finally. The inspector mistakes convenience for causality, a common disease among men of action. He's got evidence, I said. He has coincidence wrapped in authority, Wolfe corrected. 2 deaths linked by a weapon no one can find. He cannot prove it exists. Ergo, it exists only in imagination or intention. Translation? Someone has constructed the illusion of repetition to conceal the reality of design. The convenience itself is the crime. I grinned. You should charge by the metaphor. I do, he said dryly. Now, Goodwin, remain. Observe. And do not allow yourself to be arrested before dinner. Fritz is preparing boeuf bourguignon. He hung up. I stepped out of the booth, feeling lighter and less safe. When Wolfe was interested, the world got smaller and sharper, like a knife turning toward the handle. Back inside the shop, the cleanup was underway. Kramer's men had bagged the evidence, tagged the body, and forgotten about me, which was their first mistake. I slipped downstairs again, pretending to look lost. The floor was still dusty except where they'd trampled it. Near the far wall, behind a crate, something caught my eye. A faint shoe print, smaller than my own, the heel delicate and narrow. A woman's. I crouched and brushed the edge. The print overlapped a smear of silver fabric. I pulled it free. A torn scrap, soft and expensive, smelling faintly of that same perfume that had invaded Wolfe's office days ago. Mrs. Dale. I tucked it in my pocket, just as footsteps echoed on the stairs. I straightened, keeping my face casual. One of Kramer's men poked his head in. Hey, Goodwin, you're not supposed to be down here. Neither are you, I said, but I won't tell if you don't. He frowned, uncertain, then left. I looked once more at the blood-stained floor and the empty space where the gun should have been. Someone was cleaning up carefully. The only problem was, they'd missed a spot, and I was holding it. When I finally made it back to the brownstone, I smelled like basement dust, crime, and Kramer's bad attitude, a bouquet that could clear the orchids. Wolfe was in mid-debate with Fritz over the one subject that could make or break civilization, beer temperature. It is intolerable, Wolfe declared as I came in. You persist in chilling it beyond 38 degrees. Fritz sighed, towel over one shoulder, the picture of wounded dignity. It is the refrigerator, Mr. Wolfe, not I. Machines, Wolfe growled, exist to obey, not dictate. I dropped my hat and coat, deciding it was best not to join the theological dispute. If you two are done quarrelling about beverages, I said, there's been another murder. Loring's antique business is now permanently closed. That stopped Wolfe mid-harangue. His head lifted, and those heavy-lidded eyes sharpened. When? He asked. And how inconveniently? About 2 hours ago, shot clean through the chest. No gun in sight. He made a low sound that might have been sympathy, or gas. Ah, the invisible weapon returns. Yep, I said, heading for my chair. And it's got better aim than Kramer. Wolfe grunted. That would not be difficult. Wolfe demanded a full report, which meant I had to sit there and narrate the grisly details while he leaned back like a Roman emperor listening to poetry. I told him about the phone call, the unlocked door, the smell, the basement and the corpse. I even tossed in a few touches to keep it lively, since storytelling is the only art Wolfe doesn't practice. When I finished, he regarded me with what, in a more humane man, might have been gratitude. Archie, he said at last, your account is vivid, almost florid. Unfortunately, floridity obscures accuracy. Thanks, I said. I'll embroider less next time. He wagged a finger, Your métier is observation, not literature. I require data, not theatrical garnish. I shrugged. Fine. Dead man, chest wound, no gun, no signs of struggle, broken wine bottle nearby. The police think it's our missing Mauser again. Kramer's now running around like a bulldog with two tails. Wolfe's eyelids lowered in thought. 2 homicides with 1 unsubstantiated instrument, he murmured. You see, Archie, we are not facing a murderer who hides a weapon, but one who hides its existence. Great, I said. So we're chasing a ghost. He nodded. And ghosts, my dear Archie, are invariably human. Wolfe's lips compressed as he settled deeper into his chair. The situation, he began, offends logic. A weapon cannot kill twice and vanish twice unless it never existed. Tell that to Kramer, I said. He's ready to print wanted posters for the Mauser. Pfui. The inspector's conception of evidence is rudimentary. He sees coincidence and mistakes it for correlation. But the true constant is intention. He steepled his fingers. A murder weapon is an agent of purpose. If the purpose persists and the means vanishes, the agency is not material. It is psychological. I frowned. You're saying someone imagined the gun? Not imagined, constructed. A fiction sustained by fear and repetition. Our killer requires belief, not bullets, to conceal his acts. I whistled. That's one way to skip the paperwork. Wolfe ignored me. The same caliber, the same pattern of wound, and the same narrative circulated among those who profit from its myth. The gun, my dear Archie, exists because men speak of it. Well, if words can kill, I said, Kramer's been committing homicide for years. Do not trivialize, he warned. The weapon is invisible not by concealment, but by consent. Find who benefits from that illusion. That sounded like my cue to start earning my salary. I fetched my notebook and spread it open on the desk, flipping past pages full of smudged names and half-legible theories. Wolfe doesn't believe in coincidences. I don't believe in miracles. Somewhere between the two was a pattern. Loring's client list read like a banker's cocktail party. Brokers, widows, politicians, and the occasional crook with a taste for bronze cherubs. I checked each name against what little I knew. One stood out. Congressman Lionel Gates. The name rang a faint bell, like a tax notice you'd hoped was forgotten. I remembered seeing it in connection with a shipping scandal years back. Something about imported gifts that weren't exactly postcards. Gates, I said aloud. Ever hear of him? Wolfe opened his eyes a slit. A creature of ambition. Votes where the money leans. I believe he once presided over a committee investigating smuggling. Perfect, I said. A man who investigates crimes for a living and forgets to notice when he's committing them. Wolfe grunted approval. Precisely. Continue. I jotted the name in red ink and underlined it twice. All right, I said. If the Mauser didn't come from thin air, maybe it came from Europe. Wolfe's brow lifted. Or from a collector who knew what silence was worth. I made a call to a friend of mine over at the Gazette, a gossip columnist who never met a skeleton he didn't photograph. He picked up on the first ring. Archie, long time. What's Wolfe up to? Still charging by the insult? Still worth it, I said. Listen, you ever write about Congressman Gates? There was a pause. Off the record? Always, he chuckled. Then yeah, couple of years back there was talk about him and a European art syndicate. Supposedly he was getting gifts, statues, jewelry, maybe even firearms, from collectors who needed favors with customs. The whole thing got buried under an appropriations bill. Any names? Loring's came up once, but the story never ran. Too risky. Right, I said, because dead men don't file libel suits. He laughed nervously. What's this about? Let's just say your congressman's taste in antiques might be catching up with him. When I hung up, Wolfe was already watching me. His expression was the kind cats wear before pouncing. Well? He asked. Seems our friend Gates was fond of imported art. The kind you can't display at fundraisers. Wolfe's mouth curved slightly. Guns, jewels, or secrets, it makes no difference. Every acquisition demands concealment. And concealment, he said, is the one luxury politicians cannot afford. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed, hands resting like parentheses on his stomach. Ownership, Archie, is not confined to possession. A man may control a thing without ever holding it. That is the essence of power. Try telling that to the Revenue Bureau, I said. He ignored me. Consider Gates. If he arranged to acquire a weapon illegally and then caused it to vanish after its purpose was fulfilled, he does not forfeit ownership. He transfers it to fear. That's poetic, I said, but maybe someone else is doing the owning, like the widow or our client or Kramer's temper. Perhaps, he admitted. But in law, as in logic, motive resides where control begins. Find who commanded the gun, not who pulled the trigger. I flipped my notebook closed. So we're chasing the invisible owner of an invisible gun. You do make my life interesting. Wolfe's eyes opened, dark and steady. I endeavour to make it tolerable. Interest is a byproduct. I stood. All right, what next? He reached for his beer. You, of course, you will follow the spoor of Mr. Gates, with discretion. That last word made my stomach sink. Discretion and I have never been on friendly terms, but Wolfe dropped the word like a sentence. You'll trace Congressman Gates's connection to Loring, he said, without alerting either the press or the police. The man's career is as delicate as his conscience. Meaning non-existent? Meaning easily bruised. He set his glass down. Start with his staff, a secretary, an aide, someone who arranges shipments and forgets to record them. If he imported anything through Loring, you will find the residue. Residue I can handle, I said. Political favours, less so. They tend to bite. Then muzzle them, Wolfe replied coldly. Duty, Archie, is the scaffolding of civilization. That's a pretty speech, I said. What's mine made of? Taxi fares and bribes. If necessary. I sighed. All right. But if I end up in a holding cell with Kramer, I'm sending you the bill for damages, emotional and otherwise. He waved a hand. Nonsense. You thrive on peril. Now go. Fritz appeared in the doorway with a tray. Lunch is ready, Mr. Wolfe. Excellent, Wolfe said, already forgetting my existence. Archie, close the door. Civilization must be nourished. I grabbed my hat. Sure. And I'll go feed the opposite of it. Outside, the city looked ready to oblige. If you ever hear someone say detective work is all grit and gunpowder, send them to me and I'll show them my tuxedo. I was trying to remember how to breathe without popping a button when Wolfe decided to deliver a lecture on the philosophical purpose of formality. Civilization, he said from his chair, requires masks, Archie. The tuxedo is one of them. It conceals primitive intent beneath satin and starch. Murder often wears black tie. Sure, I said. But this one feels like it's strangling me for the alibi. He scowled. Endure it. You are not attending for your comfort, but my curiosity. I need eyes among the cultivated. And you're staying home to commune with beer. Precisely, he said. Fritz appeared in the doorway, looked me over, and sighed with the pride of a tailor watching his suit make bad decisions. You look magnificent, Mr. Goodwin. Thanks. I'll try to keep the magnificence from wrinkling during a rest. Wolfe's voice rumbled like a sermon. Remember, Archie, observe everything and assume nothing. Polite society kills as efficiently as the gutter, only with better lighting. I gave him a 2-finger salute. I'll drink to that, if the champagne's free. The widow's penthouse on Fifth Avenue could have hosted a coronation, or a crime scene, which turned out to be close enough. Crystal chandeliers blazed, violins sighed, and the air was thick with perfume and conversation worth inditing. I moved through the crowd, making mental notes. 3 senators pretending to like art, a museum director pretending to like senators, and one congressman pretending not to notice either. The champagne was cold, the suspicion warm. At the far end of the room stood Mrs. Alton, the widow, with that impossible combination of poise and despair that only comes from mourning in silk. Beside her was Congressman Gates, talking too easily, smiling too tightly. Across the room, I caught sight of another familiar face, Mrs. Dale, my trembling client, dressed like anxiety, wrapped in satin. She noticed me, froze, and then offered the kind of smile you give to the dentist before he drills. The orchestra struck up something cheerful and false. I took a glass from a passing tray and let the bubbles do their job. This wasn't just a dinner party, it was a powder keg in pearls. I didn't know yet who was holding the match, but judging by the crowd, everyone had pockets full of them. Mrs. Alton greeted me like an old acquaintance she couldn't quite place. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, her hand cool as porcelain. "Mr. Wolfe's assistant, isn't it? How charming of you to join us." "Delighted," I said. "You throw a fine wake." Her lips curved faintly. "You detectives do have a morbid sense of humour. Comes with the hours." She led me toward a table covered in orchids. No coincidence, I suspected, though Wolfe would have approved the species, if not the company. Her laughter came easily, but her eyes kept drifting toward the corner where Gates stood talking to Mrs. Dale. "You admire orchids?" I asked. "They were my husband's favourite," she said. "He said they were proof that beauty can survive deception." "Nice thought," I said, "unless you're the deceived." She looked up sharply. For a second, the polished widow vanished, replaced by a flash of something raw, fear or guilt, I couldn't tell which. Then the mask slid back. "Enjoy the party, Mr. Goodwin," she said softly. "And do give my regards to Mr. Wolfe. Tell him, not everything that grows in light is innocent." That line deserved a drink stronger than champagne. The clinking of crystal silenced the orchestra. Congressman Lionel Gates had claimed the floor, or the carpet, which was probably imported from some nation he'd voted against funding. He raised his glass, his grin sharp enough to need a license. "To truth," he said, "to loyalty, and to those who keep both in the dark, where they belong." The room responded with uneasy laughter. Mrs. Alton smiled too brightly. Mrs. Dale looked as if someone had just pulled the rug, possibly that same imported one, out from under her. I watched Gates. He was the kind of man who believed charm was just honesty with better tailoring. His eyes, though, flicked toward Mrs. Dale for one brief instant, sharp as a switchblade. She looked away fast. When the toast ended, applause scattered half-heartedly. A waiter passed by with refills, and I snagged another glass. The congressman's speech had left a taste worse than the champagne. Wolfe once said irony was the coward's weapon of truth, and if so, Gates had just fired a shot across the table. I drifted closer to Mrs. Dale, intending to catch a word, when I saw her hand trembling again. It wasn't nerves this time, it was terror. And somewhere behind the laughter, the orchestra hit a sour note. The crash came first, a high, brittle sound of glass surrendering to gravity. Then a gasp, a scream, and the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. For half a second, the room froze, caught between disbelief and hysteria. Then the crowd erupted. Guests stumbled for cover, heels snapping, champagne flutes flying. The orchestra abandoned music for survival. I dove toward the source, a corner near the grand piano. Mrs. Dale stood there, white as parchment, her hand at her throat. Gates was on one knee, clutching his arm. Blood seeped through his sleeve, more insult than injury. "Stay down," I barked, already scanning the room. Near the piano, I spotted the weapon, a small pistol, nickel-plated, dainty as jewellery. Not the Mauser, not by a mile. I kicked it out of reach just as a waiter tried to crawl past. "Police!" I snapped. "Call them, fast!" Mrs. Alton was screaming now, half incoherent, half theatrical. Mrs. Dale looked ready to faint, or to confess. I pressed a napkin against Gates's wound while he cursed like a senator denied a bribe. "You'll live," I said. which is more than I can say for the evening. The wail of sirens drifted in through the windows, too soon for coincidence, too late for calm. And just as I stood, I realized something Wolfe would have loved. The gun was too clean, too perfectly placed. It wasn't evidence. It was decoration. By the time the police swarmed in, the party looked like the aftermath of a champagne riot. Kramer arrived in record time, face red and temper preloaded. He spotted me and came barreling through the chaos like a bull in uniform. "Goodwin," he bellowed. "I should have known." "You're welcome," I said. "I saved the taxpayer a trip." He ignored that, stomping over to the piano where an officer bagged the dainty pistol. Kramer held it up like a prize catch. "Got it. The Mauser, huh?" I shook my head. "Wrong fish. That's a 32, not a 9mm. Try again." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "You an expert now?" "Only by necessity." The forensics man confirmed it with a nod, and Kramer swore under his breath. "Then what the hell is this?" "A question," I said. "One I suggest you ask politely before the congressman sues the city." Mrs. Dale had vanished somewhere between panic and police statements. Mrs. Alton sat rigid, whispering into her glass. Gates, patched and fuming, demanded headlines. And right in the middle of that circus, the phone rang. A patrolman answered, glanced at me, and handed it over. "Goodwin." Wolfe's voice, purred, cool, and unhurried. "You are in the presence of design, not accident." "You're telling me." "The weapon is wrong because it was meant to be found. The true instrument remains invisible." I glanced around the glittering ruin of the penthouse and felt the hairs on my neck rise. "Fine," I said, "but next time you design a murder, warn me before I wear the tuxedo." He hung up, and for the first time that evening, I realized the party wasn't over. It had just changed hosts. I should have known better than to suggest it. The words were barely out of my mouth when Wolfe's eyebrows went up like two accusing commas. "You expect me," he said, "to leave my home to inspect a location already polluted by policemen, reporters, and conjecture? Absurd." "Wolfe," I said, "it's a murder scene. You might pick up something Kramer missed, like a thought." He snorted. "Locomotion does not enlarge comprehension, Archie. It merely exposes one to inclement weather and inferior intellects." I leaned against the desk. "You're allergic to fresh air, that's your problem." "My only allergy is to wasted time," he said, reaching for his beer. I muttered something that would have blistered the orchids and grabbed my hat. "Fine. You stay here and deduce. I'll go walk the earth like a second-rate prophet." As I headed out, Fritz called after me to bring back sanity if I found any. Wolfe's parting words followed like a benediction and a curse combined. "Archie, observation without interpretation is vanity. Do try not to indulge in it." "Sure," I said, "and I'll pick up enlightenment with the evening paper." If you ever want to see civilization in its rawest form, try chasing clues through Manhattan in the rain. The sidewalks were slick enough to drown dignity, and every cab in the city was already carrying someone more desperate than me. I started at the widow's penthouse, where the doorman remembered me but not the murder. His loyalty was to tips, not truth. From there, I hit the florist, the wine merchant, and the caterer, all of whom swore they'd seen nothing except unpaid bills and bad manners. Still, I kept retracing the trail. Every guest, every supplier, every shadow that might have hidden a motive. Something about the second shooting itched at me. Wolfe was right about one thing. Repetition always meant design. By the time I stopped for a cup of coffee that could have stripped paint, I had one thought circling like a vulture. Who wanted the second shot to look like the first? The pattern was too neat. The gun was too missing. I tossed a dime on the counter and headed back into the rain. Somewhere out there, someone was laughing at the whole thing. And for once, it wasn't Wolfe. Kramer called before I could even hang up my wet coat. His tone had that smug, just polished a badge quality I know too well. "Goodwin," he growled. "Tell your boss the ballistics are in. Same grooves, same barrel marks, Same gun. The Mauser. I frowned. That's impressive, considering it doesn't exist. Don't play cute. We got the results from the lab. Perfect match. Sure, I said. And next you'll tell me the ghost reloaded it. He hung up before I could offer congratulations. I dialed Wolfe immediately. Ballistics says both bullets came from the same gun. The same missing gun. Apparently, it's firing from limbo. Pfui, Wolfe said. That is impossible. Tell that to physics. They just resigned from the NYPD. There was silence on the line. His thinking silence, the kind that makes wallpaper nervous. Archie, he said finally, you will return at once. Why? You suddenly believe in field work? No, he said dryly. I believe in deceit. Which one? Theirs or ours? Both, perhaps, but only one matters. He hung up, leaving me staring at the receiver. If Wolfe was curious enough to summon me back, something had finally cracked. And I wasn't sure whether it was the case or my patience. When I got back, Wolfe was in the plant room, breathing more deeply than he ever did outside of a dining experience. The orchids glistened like smug witnesses. The illusion of duplication, he said without preamble. A concept simple in mathematics, rare in murder. Translation? I asked. He turned, eyes sharp. If two patterns are identical, one must be original and the other contrived. Ballistics can be tampered with as readily as testimony, if one controls the means of testing. I folded my arms. You think somebody doctored the evidence? I think, he said, someone arranged for the result to precede the fact. That's poetic, I said. Mind explaining how? He smiled faintly. Not yet. But we shall find the craftsman of this illusion soon enough. Artifice leaves residue. Fritz appeared, holding a watering can. One of the pots cracked, Mr. Wolfe. It left a fine dust all over the bench. Wolfe's gaze shifted instantly, like a radar beam locking on. Show me. As Fritz led him to the broken pot, I realized I'd just witnessed the closest thing Wolfe had to enthusiasm. And if a flower pot could get that reaction, it wasn't just dirt. The flower pot was a casualty of Fritz's elbow, one of Wolfe's prized ceramic imports, now in elegant ruin. Wolfe crouched beside the fragments, a sight rare enough to make history. Observe, he said, lifting a shard between his fingers. The residue. It was a fine grey dust, smooth, with a faint sheen under the greenhouse light. I leaned closer and sniffed. Smells like machine oil, or gun oil. Indeed, Wolfe murmured. Gun oil, carbon residue, and silica. Tell me, Archie, how does such a mixture come to rest among orchids? Either the plants are shooting back, or somebody used this pot for more than begonias. He didn't answer, just straightened, and stared at the bench with new calculation. A vessel of concealment. The invisible gun must have existed somewhere, if only in parts. Someone clever enough to melt or alter it could also distribute its remnants, perhaps even as fertilizer. I blinked. You're saying the Mauser became plant food? Of a sort. Melted metal, recast, repurposed. The killer is not hiding a weapon but its remains. I whistled low. So the gun that isn't there might be in 1,000 little pieces. Or one, Wolfe said, depending on the imagination of the culprit. That was when I noticed a faint stain on Fritz's apron. Grey, oily, and not from gardening. The past week's murders had just sprouted a new root. It took an hour, 3 phone calls, and 1 favour from a friend at the post to trace the laundry slip Fritz had found tucked under the bench. It didn't belong to him, or us. The number linked to a Fifth Avenue cleaning service that handled only exclusive clientele. I paid them a visit. The manager, a man who ironed his conscience with his shirts, handed me the ledger after I hinted at police interest. The name on the account was neat, official, and irritatingly familiar. Congressman Lionel Gates. When I got back, Wolfe was waiting, surrounded by orchids and logic. Well? He asked. Your favorite congressman's been laundering more than reputation, I said. His dry cleaner handles half the city's politicians, and at least one murder suspect. Wolfe's mouth curved slightly. So, the chain completes itself, from residue to refinement. I dropped the slip on his desk. What's the play? He studied it like scripture. The invisible weapon breathes. We have seen its ashes, its disguise, and now, its custodian. You think Gates had the Mauser melted down? No, Wolfe said softly. He had it reborn. Into what? That, he said. We shall ask him tomorrow, preferably in my office, with Inspector Kramer present to savour the humiliation. Good, I said. I'll shine the chairs. And for the first time in days, Wolfe smiled. By 10 that morning, Wolfe had made it abundantly clear that civilization was on trial, and I was the bailiff. He sat at his desk dictating names, while I handled the dirty work, telephoning suspects and making invitations that sounded like velvet, but hit like subpoenas. Goodwin, Wolfe said. Be courteous. The guilty often mistake politeness for safety. Sure, I said. And the innocent mistake it for a joke. The first call went to Mrs. Dale. She gasped when I mentioned the address, then promised to come for closure. Translation: she'd rather face Wolfe than another sleepless night. The widow was next, polite as a queen, but the hesitation in her voice could have filled a confession. Congressman Gates tried to bluster. I have a committee meeting. Not as important as this one, I told him. Mister, Wolfe doesn't subpoena often, but when he does, attendance is mandatory. Even Kramer got his invitation, though his response was a symphony of curses and disbelief. By evening, I had chairs arranged, beer chilled, and nerves tightening. Fritz dusted the orchids for luck. Wolfe merely said, "The time has come for coherence. If they are late, the truth will not wait." That was optimism. In my experience, truth preferred to stall. By 7 o'clock, the brownstone had the atmosphere of a pressure cooker with lace curtains. Fritz served coffee that no one touched. The trembling lady arrived first, wrapped in remorse and perfume. Her gloves looked like they'd been through confession. "Mr. Wolfe," she whispered, I'm not sure I should be here." "Then you are precisely where you should be," Wolfe said. Next came the widow, elegant, self-possessed, and pretending not to notice her rival across the room. Her smile was carved from etiquette. Congressman Gates followed, trailing cigar smoke and self-importance. "This had better be brief," he said, dropping into a chair like he was taking a vote. And then, inevitably, Kramer. The doorbell hadn't finished ringing before his voice filled the hall. "If this is another one of Wolfe's circus acts, I want a refund." I took his hat and said, "You'll get double your money's worth in aggravation." Wolfe had yet to appear. That was part of the ritual. Let the suspects ferment before the lecture began. I took a seat near the desk, watching the uneasy triangle of faces, guilt, power, and panic, pretending to be patience. When Wolfe finally rang for me from the elevator, the silence hit like thunder waiting for lightning, and right on cue, lightning arrived. When Wolfe entered, the room rearranged itself around him. He didn't stride, Wolfe never strides, but his presence filled space the way gravity does. He moved to his desk, lowered himself into the chair with the authority of a king claiming his throne, and folded his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "falsehood is a social lubricant until it gums the machinery." Nobody laughed, not even Kramer, though I caught him smirking before he remembered it was a quote, not a joke. Wolfe's gaze drifted across the room, resting a moment on each face like a gavel tapping wood. "You have all lied," he said calmly. "Some out of fear, others for gain, one out of misplaced love. Yet none of you have succeeded. A lie is not an act, it is an echo. And tonight we shall locate the original voice." Mrs. Dale shifted in her chair, her gloved fingers twisting. The widow's eyes flicked toward Gates, who managed a smile worthy of a campaign poster. Kramer growled, "If this is philosophy, Wolfe, save it for a book club." This, Wolfe said, is anatomy, Inspector, the dissection of deceit. Archie, kindly close the door. I did. The click sounded final, like a cell lock. Whatever happened next, nobody was walking out clean. Wolfe began as surgeons do, with precision and no pity. First, he said, Mrs. Dale, you claimed your husband was being blackmailed over a weapon he did not possess. In truth, he did possess it. You, however, wished the world to believe otherwise, to protect a man who was already beyond salvation. Her chin trembled. I was afraid. Indeed, fear breeds fabrication. He turned to the widow. You, Mrs. Alton, asserted that you were at home the night of Mr. Loring's death. Yet your chauffeur insists you dismissed him early and returned in a cab from 47th Street, the location of the shop where he was killed. Her breath caught. I went to confront him, she admitted softly. He was cheating me in the sale of my husband's estate. Which estate included the Mauser, Wolfe said. A weapon purchased through Congressman Gates's private collector network, hidden to avoid scrutiny. Gates straightened. You have no proof. Proof? Wolfe smiled faintly. The cleaning bill, the ballistic fraud, the residue of oil in a flower pot, each a petal in the bouquet you arranged to disguise corruption as commerce. Kramer barked. You're saying Gates ran a gun ring out of antique shops? Wolfe inclined his head. Precisely. And when his partners threatened exposure, he silenced them, with efficiency learned in politics. The congressman's hand twitched toward his pocket. I stood, already moving. Don't, I said. You've lost enough votes for one evening. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Now, Inspector, shall we proceed to motive or confession? It was bound to happen. Kramer had been sitting there simmering like a pot left on low flame, and Wolfe's lecture finally boiled him over. Enough, he barked, slapping his knee hard enough to scare the orchids. You're not running a courtroom, Wolfe. You're showboating again, dressing up guesses like gospel. Wolfe's eyelids drooped half an inch, which meant irritation in his native dialect. Inspector, the distinction between demonstration and spectacle lies solely in the observer's intellect. Truth must sometimes be paraded before the dull-witted, or it risks being mistaken for coincidence. Kramer turned red enough to match his tie. I stepped in before he made good on his promise to rearrange Wolfe's chin. Easy, Inspector, I said, dragging a chair between them. If you're planning to strangle him, do it seated. Less mess on the carpet. He glared at me, then at Wolfe, then dropped into the chair like it owed him money. All right, he growled. If you're so damn certain, let's hear it. The grand finale. Where's your invisible gun now? Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Precisely where it has been since the beginning. Visible, admired, and profoundly misunderstood. The room went still. Even the congressman stopped pretending to breathe comfortably. Wolfe adjusted his tie. Archie, fetch the photograph from the cabinet. And just like that, the curtain began to rise. Wolfe spread the photograph on his desk, a glossy print of the bronze sculpture that had adorned the congressman's office. A handsome thing. Abstract, muscular, all curves and shadow. Gates blinked at it, puzzled. I don't see what this has to do with... You seldom do, Wolfe interrupted. This sculpture was commissioned 6 weeks before the first death. Created by an artisan named Mauro Fellini. It arrived at your townhouse 3 days after Mr. Loring's demise. That's public record, Gates snapped. What of it? The material, Wolfe said, was not bronze, at least not originally. It was melted alloy, specifically German steel with trace elements of nickel consistent with the composition of a Mauser C96. The air thickened. Mrs. Alton gasped. Mrs. Dale's gloved hand rose to her mouth. You're insane, Gates said, standing. Sit, Wolfe commanded. The word had weight. The gun did not vanish. It evolved. Melted in a private foundry, paid for through a third-party contract, then recast as art. You hid your crime behind beauty, Congressman. A fitting irony. Kramer muttered. Holy, and stopped short. Wolfe went on, unhurried. 2 deaths served one purpose, to protect your reputation and destroy those who might expose your trade in illegal firearms. Your weapon was not missing. It was on display. Silence. Gates' hand shook. You can't prove that. Wolfe leaned back. The foundry records will suffice, as will your sculptor, who has already been persuaded to speak. Kramer stood, signaling his men. That's it. He's done. Gates's face collapsed like wet plaster. The show was over, and the props were real. Before Kramer could reach him, Mrs. Dale rose from her chair. Her face was pale, her voice barely human. Stop, she whispered. It wasn't his idea, it was mine. The room froze again. Wolfe didn't move. Explain. She swallowed hard. He said the gun had to disappear. I knew someone who could melt it down, someone who owed me. I told him I'd handle it. I thought, if I did, he'd stop. But he didn't. Her breath caught. I helped make the thing that killed them both. For once, Kramer hesitated. She looked too broken for handcuffs. Wolfe inclined his head slightly, his tone unexpectedly gentle. You sought to shield him, and in so doing, became his accomplice. It is the most human of errors. Loyalty misplaced. Tears slipped down her cheek. She nodded once, a small gesture of surrender. Kramer gave the quietest order I'd ever heard him speak. His men led her out first. The congressman followed, his dignity in pieces. When the door shut behind them, the room exhaled. Remind me, I said softly. What's worse than being right? Being right too soon, Wolfe replied. When the last car pulled away, Fritz began clearing the battlefield with silent efficiency. Wolfe had already retreated to the plant rooms, his version of victory laps. I cracked open 2 bottles from the fridge and followed him. He was misting the orchids, humming something that sounded suspiciously like triumph. I held 1 bottle out. For the conqueror of congressmen. He took it without looking. Your levity is misplaced, Archie. There is no triumph in exposure, only restoration. Sure, I said, but restoration deserves carbonation. He grunted, sipped, and said, This case reaffirmed an old truth. Power hides its sins in plain sight. One must merely have the patience to look past its polish. Spoken like a man allergic to both polish and politics. He gave a faint smile. And yet, Archie, both persist. I leaned against the doorframe, watching him among his flowers. The man could dismantle a conspiracy and still find solace in petals. Beer's cold, I said. Truth's colder. Quite, Wolfe agreed. But both, when properly served, are tolerable. We drank in silence. Outside, Manhattan went on pretending innocence, and inside, we let the orchids breathe what was left of it. It began, as it often did, with Wolfe refusing to raise his voice. He looked at the congressman, not with anger, not even with disgust, but with the kind of calm that makes a man wish he were guilty of something smaller. Mr. Gates, he said, when you commissioned the sculpture for your foyer, did you request the artist to use a specific metal, or did you merely provide him with the means? The silence that followed could have been bottled and sold as paralysis. Gates's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. What are you implying? Wolfe leaned forward slightly. I imply nothing. I inquire whether you provided him, perhaps through an intermediary, with a certain German alloy, hard, dense, and conveniently untraceable. Gates stared at him. Even Kramer stopped shifting his weight. Because, Wolfe said softly, that, sir, is where your invisible gun has been hiding, not in absence, but in form. The congressman's knuckles whitened on the armrest. Wolfe folded his hands. A man may conceal his guilt beneath politics, but metal, Mr. Gates, never lies. And just like that, the game had changed from accusation to confession, though no one had spoken yet. The Mauser, Wolfe continued. ceased to exist as a firearm the day it was melted, 5 days before the first killing. It was reborn, so to speak, in bronze. He reached for the photograph on his desk. A polished sculpture, sleek and modern, an abstract form of intertwining arms and folded wings. It looked harmless, almost noble. "This piece," Wolfe said, "was delivered to Mrs. Alton's gallery the same week Mr. Loring was shot. It drew praise for its balance, its symmetry, its quiet menace." Mrs. Alton's voice trembled. I didn't know." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "You knew only that it was beautiful. The congressman arranged for its donation to your gallery, ensuring it remained publicly visible and privately untouchable. Its existence as art rendered it immune to suspicion. One cannot requisition an exhibit for ballistics testing." He tapped the photograph with a forefinger. "Yet the grooves remain. Beneath the sheen, the molecules still remember their first purpose." Kramer muttered a low oath. Gates's lips thinned. "This is absurd. Melting a gun doesn't erase evidence." "No," Wolfe agreed. "It transforms it, much as you transformed corruption into culture and guilt into philanthropy." For a moment, even the orchids seemed to hold their breath. Wolfe adjusted himself in his chair, his voice smooth and unhurried. "The pattern is elegant, if vile. You, Congressman, arranged a transaction so that the very evidence of your crime would become the symbol of your virtue." Gates managed a sneer. "You think too much, Wolfe." "I assure you, sir," Wolfe said, "it is difficult to think too much in your presence." Archie almost choked, trying not to laugh. Wolfe went on. "The art dealer facilitated the sale, but his greed proved inconvenient. He demanded a larger share, so you silenced him. When Mrs. Dale learned the truth, you promised protection. What you offered instead was panic, and panic breeds murder." Gates's jaw tightened. "You have no proof." "Proof?" Wolfe's eyes glimmered. "Your sculptor received payment through a shell account registered to the Congressional Office budget. That, Inspector, will be sufficient for the district attorney, though my satisfaction lies elsewhere." Kramer grunted. "You're saying he used public funds to melt a murder weapon?" Wolfe inclined his head. "Indeed, a most literal example of laundering, both moral and metallic." Mrs. Alton's voice broke. "It was right there, in the gallery, all along." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "Art often imitates life. In this case, it concealed it." He turned toward Mrs. Dale, whose gloves trembled like a confession waiting for air. Wolfe didn't raise his voice, but his gaze shifted to Mrs. Dale with surgical precision. "You knew," he said quietly. "From the beginning." She flinched. "No." "Pfui. You arranged the foundry contact, the delivery schedule, even the receipt of payment under your husband's name. You believed you were preserving a man's reputation, not his crimes." Tears welled in her eyes. "He said it was just politics, that it would all go away once the sculpture was finished." "Ah," Wolfe murmured. "The oldest lie of all. That guilt can be reshaped as easily as metal." Her voice cracked. "I didn't want anyone hurt. I thought, if I helped, it would end." "It never ends," Wolfe said, "when one lies to shield the unworthy." Her composure dissolved. "He told me they'd ruin him. I thought I loved him." "You did," Wolfe said gently. "That was your first mistake." The silence that followed was longer than pity and shorter than peace. Finally, she whispered, "Yes, I helped him melt it. I told the sculptor it was sentimental metal. He never questioned it." Kramer moved forward, handcuffs glinting. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes. "Inspector, proceed with the formalities. Humanity, I fear, will provide the rest." Her sob was the sound of something breaking that had been fragile all along. Kramer's patience, never robust to begin with, snapped like a matchstick. "You've built this whole circus on fancy talk and metaphors. Where's your proof, Wolfe? A lecture doesn't hold up in court. Wolfe didn't so much as blink. Evidence, Inspector, is not always loud. The metallurgical report from the foundry will suffice, as will the chemical composition of the sculpture. Identical, incidentally, to Mauser-grade steel, with carbon trace levels of 0.8%. Kramer's jaw dropped. How the hell? I inquired this morning, Wolfe said, sipping his beer as if reciting the weather. A friend at the Museum of Modern Art analyzed a sample under pretext of restoration. I anticipated your skepticism. Kramer grunted, half fury, half resignation. You'd make a lousy cop. I have too much respect for law to enforce it, Wolfe replied. That earned a snort from me. Kramer sighed, signaling his men. All right. The lady comes with us. The congressman's office gets raided in the morning. As they left, Wolfe simply said, Ensure that the sculpture is preserved, Inspector. Beauty, even born of deceit, deserves a record. Kramer muttered something about ulcers and paperwork. Wolfe merely reached for another beer. He'd already moved on, to reflection. When the last uniform disappeared and the door shut, the brownstone felt heavier, as if the air itself had been cross-examined. Wolfe stared at the empty chair where Mrs. Dale had sat, then at the photograph still lying on the desk. Well, I said, at least we proved murder and modern art have something in common. They both rely on good presentation. Wolfe grunted. Your levity is misplaced. Maybe, I said, but it's that or drink myself into abstraction. He ignored me. A weapon that kills twice and then adorns a gallery wall. It is an irony worthy of the Greeks. Yeah, I said, but at least the Greeks didn't have congressmen. He almost smiled. Do not assume history lacked its Gateses. Only the terminology changes. I leaned against the desk. You ever notice, boss, how art and murder both depend on lies that look like truth? He regarded me over his glass. A perceptive remark, Archie. Though art seeks immortality through deception, and murder merely fears extinction. Nice distinction, I said. Maybe. I'll print it on a business card. Do so, he murmured, and send the bill to Congress. I had to hand it to him. No one closed a case like Wolfe. Later, the brownstone settled back into its usual rhythms. The faint clatter from the kitchen, the sigh of the elevator, the distant hum of traffic beyond the curtained windows. Wolfe had retreated to the plant rooms, where the orchids hung like quiet spectators. I followed with 2 bottles from the fridge, the unofficial ritual of victory and weariness combined. He was misting the blossoms, his massive frame half lost among the hanging pots. I handed him a bottle. Here's to art appreciation, Wolfe style. He took it, nodded once. I despise irony, Archie, yet the world seems incapable of surviving without it. Yeah, I said. Truth's a tough drink, needs a chaser. He regarded the orchids thoughtfully. Truth, my dear Archie, exacts no price. Only fear gives it value. That's deep, I said. Remind me to embroider it on your beer napkins. He didn't answer. The only sound was the faint hiss of the sprayer and the city breathing somewhere far below. I leaned back against the wall. You ever think we make a living out of ruining people's illusions? He gave me a sidelong look. Illusions require maintenance. I merely perform the pruning. I raised my bottle. To pruning then. He raised his. And to silence. And for once, we both meant it. When the echoes of confession faded and the last footsteps left the brownstone, silence returned, thick, reflective, and strangely human. Wolfe's orchids glowed softly in the lamplight, as if even they sensed that beauty and guilt had once shared the same shape. A weapon turned to art, a lie sculpted into truth. It was justice in the most ironic form. But I keep wondering, when loyalty blinds the heart and truth demands its price, which would you choose to protect? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.